In the past decade, China has launched what many have called the most ambitious foreign policy initiative in modern history, known as the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. This colossal program aimed to reshape global trade and diplomacy through a sprawling network of infrastructure projects that span continents. From Southeast Asia to Africa, Eastern Europe to Latin America, China invested over $1.3 trillion across more than 140 countries, building high-speed railways, industrial zones, highways, and deep-sea ports. On paper, it was the perfect strategy: position China as the center of global trade, while deepening political ties and securing vital resources. But things didn't go as planned. What started as a bold vision to extend influence and economic cooperation has increasingly turned into a story of financial strain, political blowback, and unfinished projects scattered across the globe. Massive developments that once promised growth and prosperity are now mired in debt, mismanagement, and controversy. Countries that once welcomed Chinese loans with open arms are struggling to repay them, while Beijing finds itself entangled in a web of diplomatic tension and mounting financial losses. As the dust settles, the Belt and Road looks less like a highway to prosperity and more like a cautionary tale of overreach and hubris. So how did such an ambitious plan unravel so quickly? How did China's grand design to reshape the global order end up riddled with risk? To answer that, we need to go back to the beginning, to the motivations behind the initiative, the choices that shaped it, and the growing cracks that were long ignored. To understand why China undertook such a sweeping global endeavor, we need to look beyond the cranes and concrete. The Belt and Road Initiative wasn't just an infrastructure project. It was a geopolitical statement. Officially launched in 2013 by President Xi Jinping, BRI was framed as a modern revival of the ancient Silk Road, the legendary trade network that once connected China to the rest of the known world. But beneath the symbolism was a far more strategic intent. As China's economy surged and its ambitions grew, the country was looking for a way to cement its role as a global power, and BRI became the tool to make that happen. There were multiple goals folded into this singular vision. First, it was about influence, building deep ties with countries across Asia, Africa, and Europe by financing the very infrastructure they needed to grow. By becoming a key lender and builder, China could shape global alliances and displace Western influence in emerging regions. Second, BRI allowed China to secure access to natural resources like oil, gas, and rare minerals, especially from energy-rich partners such as Russia, Qatar, and Malaysia. These investments weren't just about ports and pipelines, they were about future-proofing China's energy security. But there were also domestic motives. China's breakneck industrial growth had created massive excess capacity, too much steel, too much cement, and too many workers. Demand at home was slowing, and Chinese companies were desperate for projects to keep their operations running. BRI offered an elegant solution: push this surplus outward by exporting infrastructure development overseas. At the same time, China had built up trillions in foreign currency reserves from decades of trade surpluses. Instead of letting that capital sit idle, Beijing saw an opportunity to put it to use through loans that could yield both political and financial returns. On paper, it all seemed to align: diplomacy, economics, and national pride in one sweeping strategy. But the speed at which it unfolded and the scale of its ambition would soon expose deep flaws in execution. What China saw as a masterstroke of global leadership would slowly begin to reveal itself as something far more fragile. As the Belt and Road Initiative gained momentum, money began flowing fast and in enormous volumes. Dozens of nations, especially in the developing world, eagerly signed on for highways, railroads, power plants, and ports. For many of these countries, the promise was irresistible. Chinese loans arrived quickly, came with fewer restrictions than those from Western institutions, and were tied to visible, tangible progress. Unlike the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, which often demanded rigorous environmental checks, governance reforms, and anti-corruption guarantees, China's approach was refreshingly simple: sign the deal, accept the terms, and construction would begin. But that simplicity came at a cost. The loans often carried higher interest rates, shorter repayment periods, and fewer protections. Many recipient countries were already financially fragile, and Chinese funding simply papered over deeper structural problems. These weren't projects that would always generate revenue or long-term value. In many cases, they were politically motivated, economically unfeasible, or poorly planned. Yet, with little due diligence and immense pressure to expand, China kept lending and countries kept borrowing. Soon, the warning signs became hard to ignore. Defaults began to rise. According to estimates, over 60% of China's Belt and Road loans are now considered distressed, meaning they're at serious risk of not being repaid. That figure represents hundreds of billions of dollars, money that was supposed to strengthen China's financial reach but now threatens to become a massive liability. Countries like Pakistan, Turkey, and Egypt have all taken in billions, only to find themselves unable to keep up with payments. And unlike typical development loans, these agreements gave China limited leverage for course correction once things went wrong. The Belt and Road, once sold as a model of mutual growth, began to look more like a trap of debt and dependency. For China, what started as a confident show of strength was beginning to spiral into a collection of shaky investments, each carrying political consequences and financial risk. The sheer scale of lending and the lack of guardrails had created a web of fragile relationships that were beginning to snap. As the financial cracks in the Belt and Road Initiative widened, the diplomatic ones followed. What China had framed as a global partnership began to be seen, increasingly, as something more self-serving in country after country. What was initially welcomed as a generous investment began to feel like a strategic trap, and for many governments, the promises of prosperity were quickly replaced with the pressure of mounting debt and lost autonomy. This shift was most clearly seen in how BRI loans affected sovereignty and political leverage. Countries that defaulted found themselves in precarious positions, not just economically but diplomatically. When Sri Lanka failed to repay its loans for the Hambantota port, it had little choice but to hand over control to China through a 99-year lease. The optics were damning. A key national asset now belonged, effectively, to a foreign power. Critics called it a textbook case of debt trap diplomacy, and it sent a chilling message to other nations caught in similar arrangements. The backlash wasn't limited to Asia. In Africa, resentment grew over projects staffed by Chinese workers, using Chinese materials, with little benefit flowing to the local economy. In Europe, questions were raised about China's growing stake in strategic assets, like ports in Greece and Italy. What was initially seen as economic cooperation started to resemble influence spying, and in many cases, a quiet erosion of sovereignty. The very tool China used to gain friends was now straining its relationships. Instead of strengthening its global standing, China found itself entangled in diplomatic friction, rising suspicion, and in some cases, outright hostility. Countries began to reassess their commitments, pause or cancel projects, and even turn back to Western lenders despite their slower, more conditional terms. The Belt and Road Initiative was meant to build bridges, but increasingly, it was burning them. As the Belt and Road expanded, so did the list of unfinished, unnecessary, or failing projects, a growing catalog of broken promises that stretched across continents. What was once hailed as a wave of transformative infrastructure soon began to resemble a patchwork of overbuilt ports, deserted highways, and empty industrial parks. From Pakistan to Montenegro, from Kazakhstan to Malaysia, the cracks weren't just metaphorical, they were literal. Take the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPAC ship component of BRI, announced with a staggering $60 billion budget. A decade later, many of its key projects remain incomplete, riddled with delays, security concerns, and cost overruns. In Kazakhstan, the $9 billion Korgos Gateway Dry Port was billed as a strategic transit hub, but experts widely regard it as unnecessary and underutilized. In Montenegro, a Chinese-built highway cost so much that the government struggled to pay back the loan, triggering fears of national bankruptcy for a road that, to this day, ends abruptly in a rural stretch of nowhere. The same story repeats elsewhere. Infrastructure built without a clear economic case, often disconnected from local needs or realities. In some cases, host governments lacked the capacity to maintain the new systems. In others, corruption plagued the process from start to finish. According to the World Bank, over a third of all BRI projects have faced serious issues ranging from environmental damage and labor violations to allegations of bribery and financial mismanagement. The common thread in all of this was speed over scrutiny. China, eager to expand its influence and deploy its surplus industrial capacity, rushed to sign deals and break ground. But the lack of oversight both from Beijing and the host nations meant that many projects weren't designed for long-term success. And now, across the Belt and Road landscape, the evidence of that haste is painfully visible. Idle cranes, crumbling concrete, and growing public resentment. As the economic tides turned, China found itself facing the very problem it had tried to avoid, a massive financial reckoning. For years, the outflow of capital through Belt and Road loans had been relentless. But now, with dozens of countries unable to meet their repayment terms and global economic conditions tightening, China's role was shifting from ambitious lender to reluctant bill collector. The wave of outbound investment had crashed, and the returns weren't coming in. The numbers are staggering. Of the estimated $1.3 trillion invested under BRI, nearly $780 billion is now considered at serious risk, either in default, delayed, or under renegotiation. That's more than the entire GDP of Switzerland. In response, China has already disbursed over $240 billion in bailout loans, not to finance new development, but to simply keep its borrowers afloat. What was supposed to be a cycle of investment and repayment has turned into a giant unstable game of economic triage. This is happening at a time when China can least afford it. At home, the Chinese economy is under stress. Growth is slowing. The property sector is teetering, and youth unemployment is rising. The overcapacity in steel, cement, and construction, the very issue BRI was supposed to solve, still lingers. Now compounded by weakening global demand, with its own finances under pressure, China is being forced to reconsider its appetite for high-risk international lending. The result is a clear shift. The era of easy loans is over. China is now pulling back, halting new funding, demanding repayments, and reassessing its overseas commitments. But this creates a new dilemma. If Beijing stops funding half-finished projects, it risks leaving its partners in economic limbo and damaging its reputation further. If it continues to pour in money, it deepens its exposure to risky ventures. That may never pay off. Either way, the hangover has arrived. The Belt and Road's promise of mutual prosperity is giving way to a sobering reality: financial strain, failed expectations, and a global network of partners now burdened by debt. In doubt? When the Belt and Road Initiative was first unveiled, it wasn't just seen as an economic strategy, it was a statement of global leadership. For many, it signaled the arrival of China as the world's new superpower, confident, and ready to reshape the global order on its own terms. But now, more than a decade later, that carefully crafted image is beginning to erode. The same initiative that once elevated China's influence is threatening to expose its vulnerabilities, not just abroad, but at home. Across the developing world, trust in Chinese investment is faltering. Countries are questioning whether the benefits of BRI were ever real or merely a mirage cloaked in the language of cooperation. The abandoned projects, the debt crises, the corruption scandals, all of it has turned what was once seen as opportunity into caution and skepticism. In Africa, Southeast Asia, and even parts of Europe, governments are pulling back, reassessing deals, or quietly distancing themselves from future Chinese financing. Meanwhile, China's own domestic challenges are beginning to mirror the problems. It exported the same debt-fueled expansion, overbuilding, and fragile returns that characterize many BRI projects also haunt the Chinese property sector, where massive developers like Evergrande have collapsed under the weight of unsustainable growth at every level, from real estate to railways. The cracks are showing. And for a country trying to project economic dominance, internal instability sends the opposite message. Geopolitically, the timing couldn't be worse. As global interest rates rise and economic uncertainty deepens, many countries are turning inward, prioritizing fiscal stability over foreign influence. China, once celebrated for offering a faster, no-strings-attached alternative to Western lenders, is now viewed with greater suspicion, not as a savior, but as a creditor with its own political agenda. The soft power that BRI was meant to cultivate is now at risk of unraveling. What remains is a hard truth. China's vision of global leadership may have been over-leveraged and overestimated. The Belt and Road was supposed to be a legacy-defining achievement, but instead, it may become a cautionary tale of ambition that outpaced strategy. The Belt and Road Initiative began as a bold reimagining of China's global role, a sweeping effort to build influence, secure resources, and showcase economic strength. But a decade later, that vision is fraying, crushed under the weight of unsustainable debt, diplomatic backlash, and failed execution. What was once hailed as the project of the century is now a symbol of overreach. China set out to build a new world order through steel, concrete, and capital. Instead, it now faces unpaid loans, abandoned partners, and a damaged reputation. The road ahead is no longer paved with opportunity, but with caution.